This is the Terracotta Army. 8,000 warriors buried over 2,000 years ago. One of the greatest wonders of the world.
The Terracotta Army is one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in human history. Every year, millions of people stand at the edge of those underground pits and stare down at the rows of clay soldiers and think they understand what they are looking at. They do not. Albert Lin just uncovered a layer beneath it that is honestly terrifying. And the deeper his scanners reached, the clearer it became that the emperor did not just build a tomb. He built his final kingdom on top of something monstrous. There are things down there that do not belong in a burial site. Secret chambers, strange disturbances in the earth, a history of betrayal that was sealed underground while people were still breathing. Here is the truth that the clay soldiers were never meant to let out. The army is not standing there to protect the emperor. It is standing there to make sure the truth never surfaces. Forbidden afterlife realm. Most people who visit this site fixate on the warriors. 8,000 individual clay figures, each one unique, each one with a distinct face, spread across massive underground pits that stretch further than most people realize. But the warriors are just the front entrance. The full scale of this underground complex covers thousands of acres. Researchers who have looked at the broader layout believe the emperor was not simply preparing for death. He was constructing a complete backup version of his empire. If the world above collapsed, if his dynasty crumbled, and his enemies won, his spirit would still have an entire civilization waiting beneath the earth. Perfect, permanent, and entirely under his control. This is why the complex includes clay, stables, bronze tools still functional after 2,000 years, and sculpted animals built from the same fired earth as the soldiers. There are clay birds, clay farm equipment, every detail of daily life reproduced underground, so the emperor would want for nothing. But there is a theory that goes much further than simple preparation. Some researchers believe the emperor was not just planning for death. He was trying to defeat it. He spent decades obsessively searching for a potion of immortality, sending expeditions across the known world, consulting mystics and alchemists, consuming substances that his advisors claimed would extend his life indefinitely. His obsession was not a rumor. It is documented. He genuinely believed that death was a problem with a solution, and he had the resources of an entire empire to throw at finding it. When those searches came back empty, he turned to the tomb itself. Some scholars now believe the entire complex was not a resting place, but a machine, a vast ritualistic engine designed to pull his soul back across the boundary between death and life. Every clay soldier, every channel of liquid mercury, every star painted across the ceiling of the inner chamber was a working component of that machine, a map for his spirit to follow home. It sounds like superstition until you see the precision. The soldiers do not face in a random direction. They face east toward the territories of the enemies the emperor spent his life conquering. He was not resting. Even in death, he was positioned for the next war. Every detail was intentional, and the real shock came when high-resolution cameras looked past those clay faces and into the dark spaces beyond them. The investigator, Albert Lin, did not arrive at this site the way a typical visitor arrives. He understood the weight of what he was walking into before he ever stepped off the plane. Lin is not the kind of researcher who approaches a mystery with a shovel and a notebook. He works with tools built for finding things that are not meant to be found. Scanning technology originally developed for locating buried objects in active conflict zones, instruments that can read the earth the way an X-ray reads a body. His work is recognized at the highest levels of the field internationally. He has operated in some of the most sensitive archaeological environments on the planet. None of that fully prepared him for what the Chinese government had been sitting on here for decades. Getting access to the restricted areas of this site was nearly impossible. For decade after decade, the most sensitive sections were kept under strict government control. Drone flights were prohibited over the entire complex. Every scan required authorization from the highest levels of oversight. Even Chinese researchers' decades of experience on the site often worked without knowing the complete picture of what lay beneath their feet. The information was compartmentalized deliberately. Different teams knew different pieces. No one outside a very small circle knew everything. Somehow, Lin obtained permission to go where no foreign investigator had ever been allowed to go before. How that permission was secured has never been fully explained. From the moment his team set foot on the site, the tension was immediate and physical. Officers in uniform monitored his every movement. They examined his equipment piece by piece before allowing it inside. Every drone flight required a separate formal request. Every scan was conducted with someone standing directly behind him, watching watching the screen as the data came in. As his team assembled their instruments inside the pits, the air felt dense in a way that had nothing to do with depth or temperature. Lin said afterward that standing at the center of the complex felt like being in a space that was not built for the living. The observation is not metaphorical. Very few people had ever stood in those specific locations. Even fewer had been permitted to point instruments at what was underneath. He moved through chambers sealed for over 2,000 years. The clay soldiers rose in every direction. Some posed as though they were moments away from drawing a weapon, others holding a stillness that felt more unsettling than aggression. He saw carriages with wheels still structurally sound, stables with clay horses posed mid-stride, as though waiting for AA who would never come, bronze swords and spear tips that could still draw blood today, tools laid down mid-task as though the worker had simply stepped out and never returned. Every pit was a frozen moment, a room where time had simply stopped and stayed. But Lin was not there to look at the art. He was there to find what the human eye could not see. What the scanners found, his drones went up carrying the most advanced scanning instruments available. On the ground, his team moved radar systems in careful sweeps across the floor, reading the earth dozens of feet below their boots. As he watched the rows of silent soldiers from above, an unease settled over the team that grew with every passing hour. The beauty of the sculptures seemed to be performing a function, drawing the eye upward and outward, keeping attention on the surface away from whatever lay underneath. It was not paranoia, it was pattern recognition. Something was waiting to be found, something the emperor had spent enormous effort to ensure no one ever found. The local population around this site has always known it as a cursed place. That reputation predates the 1974 discovery by centuries. The farmers who broke through into the first pit said their lives were permanently altered by what they uncovered. Some lost their land to government acquisition. Others lost their health under circumstances that were never clearly explained. The story that has circulated ever since is that they opened something that was never supposed to be open, and that opening left a mark on everyone it touched. Lin had to hold that aside. He is a scientist, but even a scientist carries something when he steps into a space where thousands of people met a violent end beneath layers of clay and silence. The technology Lin used is called ground-penetrating radar. It works by firing precise pulses of energy into the earth. When those pulses strike something solid, a wall, a floor, a buried object, a mass of compressed material, they reflect back to the surface and build a picture of what is hidden below. A map made entirely of shadows and echoes. When those maps appeared on his screens, the team went quiet. Walls that appeared on no existing architectural record. Vertical shafts dropping more than 100 feet straight into the ground. And clusters of shapes. Thousands of small, densely packed objects that no one could immediately identify. One theory is that these clusters represent the emperor's personal possessions. Everyday items from his life reproduced in permanent materials so they would never deteriorate. The kind of objects a man obsessed with eternity would want close at hand. Another theory is far darker. Some researchers believe the scanners were not reading objects at all. They were reading the remains of the emperor's actual court. Not clay figures standing in for real people, but real people placed there in person to serve in the afterlife as they had served in life. The deeper the equipment reached into the ground, the more the underground landscape stopped looking like a complex and started looking like an enormous chaotic burial ground. Layer after layer of disturbed earth. Deep shadows that had no architectural explanation. The picture being built on those screens was not what anyone had prepared for. The graves beneath the army. For a long time, no aircraft had ever been permitted over this site. The airspace above it was effectively classified. Albert Lin changed that. He became the first person to fly scanning equipment above the emperor's burial complex and look down at it from above. From that altitude, the true scale of the underground world came into focus in a way that decades of ground-level research had never been able to reveal. He used a tool called LiDAR, a laser-based imaging system that cuts through vegetation, surface soil, and obscuring material to map buried structures with precision. What it showed under the pits the world already knows about was a dense, sprawling network of hidden structures. Buried walls extending far beyond known boundaries, collapsed chambers that do not appear on any existing plan, and areas where large numbers of people appeared to have been placed in the earth simultaneously. Some of these locations showed thermal signatures consistent with ancient fires, evidence of intense heat events absorbed into the ground itself, preserved there for 2 millennia. Then, the team found the section that brought everything to a stop. Deep below the feet of the clay soldiers, the scans revealed clusters of irregular, disturbed holes in the earth, too chaotic to be intentional architecture, too organized to be the product of natural geological processes. The pattern matched what forensic archaeologists recognize immediately. Mass graves. The soil in those areas was damaged in a specific way, compressed and fractured in patterns consistent with enormous enormous force applied suddenly. Not the gradual, even weight of time and earth settling, but the concentrated, violent force of something catastrophic. Fracture lines running through the stratigraphy scattered dense shapes corresponding to human remains. Lin looked at the readout and did not speak for a long moment. He had seen difficult data before. This was different. What sits beneath the clay army is not simply a palace for a dead ruler. It is a graveyard, and it is not a graveyard for people who were honored. The historical record states that 700,000 people were conscripted to build this complex. 700,000. The construction took decades. People arrived from across China and did not return home. For a long time, historians assumed they were released when the work was done, scattered back to their villages and farms. The scan data suggests a different explanation. If even a fraction of those workers were sealed inside when construction was complete, the Terracotta Army stands above one of the largest mass burial sites in the history of human civilization. The theory that has circulated for centuries is that the emperor used the construction project as a deliberate tool of elimination. People he considered threats, political rivals, dissidents, anyone who had seen too much or knew too much, were assigned to the work sites under the cover of national service. And then, when their usefulness was exhausted, arrangements were made to ensure they never left. The radar data made this theory very difficult to dismiss. The soil disturbance patterns were consistent with violent movement, what forensic geologists call struggle layers, earth that has been mixed and compressed by bodies in motion. The tunnels appear to have been sealed from the outside while people were still inside them. And in the lower levels, the scans picked up signatures matching the profile of metal components, potential remnants of the mechanical crossbow traps described in ancient accounts. Devices engineered to fire on anyone who entered the sealed passages without authorization. Most researchers had assumed the wooden trigger mechanisms would have rotted away over 2,000 years. The bronze components are another matter entirely. The LiDAR also found something that no previous research had detected. A pyramid structure of densely packed earth buried directly beneath the main mound, hidden so completely that it is invisible from the surface. A secret inside a secret. Whatever the emperor considered most critical was buried under everything else, protected by layers upon layers of stone, soil, clay soldiers, and the bodies of the people who built them. The perfect rows of warriors above were not arranged for beauty or ceremony. They were arranged as a seal. What they were covering was not glory. It was the true cost of building an empire that was designed to last forever. The prince who died in the dark. Near the center of the scan, the team noticed an anomaly that did not fit the surrounding pattern. Beneath the organized layout of known chambers, there was a single isolated void, older than the structures around it, dug significantly deeper, as though whoever placed it there wanted it beneath everything else, invisible, unreachable, and forgotten by design. Inside that void was one skeleton. This person had not been discarded like the others. The bones were arranged with deliberate care. They belonged to a young man, probably in his early 20s. The objects found near the remains were not the belongings of a laborer or a prisoner. They were expensive, high status, the kind of possessions carried by someone born into significant power. But what silenced every person in that room was what the imaging revealed inside the skull. A bronze arrowhead driven deep into the bone. This was not an accident. This was not the residual debris of a battle fought somewhere nearby. This was an execution, precise, deliberate, and carried out on someone who had been buried separately, carefully, and in a location specifically engineered to prevent anyone from ever finding him. The question of how he died was answered in seconds. The question of who he was took longer, and the answer that emerged was deeply disturbing. Ancient records from the period document the sons of the first emperor, princes born into extraordinary privilege, raised inside a court where power and paranoia existed in equal measure, and trust was something no one could safely extend to anyone. Several of those princes disappeared from the historical record without explanation. Their names appeared in documents and then simply stopped. No account of their deaths, no record of exile or disgrace, just a silence where a life used to be, as though the record itself had been instructed to forget them. As researchers examined the details surrounding this burial, the location relative to the central mound, the quality of the grave goods, the depth, the extraordinary care taken to conceal it from above, a picture assembled itself that no one in that room wanted to accept. This was not a worker. This was not an ordinary prisoner. This young man may have been one of the emperor's own children. He was not killed by an enemy from outside. He was killed by an order that came from within his own bloodline. The chamber itself reinforced the horror. It was not shaped like a tomb. The dimensions matched a confinement cell. The positioning of the skeleton suggested the young man may have been held in that underground space alive for weeks or months before the end came. Kept breathing, kept silent, erased from the world above while he was still very much present in the world below. The stress markers visible in the bone structure were consistent with prolonged confinement under difficult conditions. There is a theory about who gave the order. The emperor's successor successor was his second son, a man who seized power in the immediate aftermath of his father's death. Historians have long suspected that his consolidation of power involved the systematic elimination of every sibling who could credibly challenge his claim to rule. Not one or two competitors, all of them. The scans found multiple additional voids matching the dimensions of this prince's chamber distributed at intervals around the main mound. The same shape, the same depth, the same deliberate placement beneath the level of everything else. An entire royal generation erased and buried alongside the workers and prisoners who built their father's tomb. In the eyes of the man who took the throne, they were all equally dangerous. They were all secrets, and secrets in the world the first emperor created belonged underground. The scrolls that survived inside sealed chambers near the emperor's primary burial location, researchers found something they had not expected to still exist after 2,000 years. Bamboo scrolls. To preserve them, the team had to work inside a controlled environment where temperature and humidity were held within tolerances measured in fractions. The scrolls were extraordinarily fragile. Exposure to the wrong conditions for even a few minutes could have destroyed them permanently. The process of opening them was painstaking, the work of weeks rather than days. What the texts contained when they were finally read aloud was not a catalogue of achievements. It was not a monument to the emperor's legacy. It felt to the historians who read it more like a record of crimes. Line by line, the scrolls described a society governed by fear rather than law. One document recorded an imperial decree ordering 460 scholars and intellectuals buried alive, not executed quickly, buried. The offense was maintaining philosophical and historical ideas that the emperor had not sanctioned. Ideas that implied other ways of organizing the world were possible. That his power was not the only kind of power. Other scrolls documented the systematic burning of books across China. Not just political texts, history, philosophy, science, medical knowledge. The deliberate destruction of any recorded thought that might give someone a framework for questioning the emperor's absolute authority. Some of the most disturbing documents were confessions, signed by engineers, builders, and craftsmen who had worked on the tomb complex. Reading the charges against them is a deeply uncomfortable experience. Some were accused of harboring critical thoughts about the emperor's methods, others of insufficient speed, others of associations with people who had themselves been accused of something. The chain of accusation extending outward in every direction with no logical limit. The confessions were extracted, recorded, filed, and then the people who signed them joined the thousands already beneath the clay. Every person on that construction site was being watched. Every action was evaluated. Every relationship was a potential liability. One wrong word, one moment of visible hesitation, one accusation from a colleague with something to gain, and you became part of the foundation rather than someone who worked on it. As historians read those texts aloud inside the complex, Lin stood in silence and watched the clay soldiers. He said afterward that, in that moment, the figures changed in front of him. They stopped being extraordinary works of art. They stopped being symbols of military power or imperial ambition or the skill of ancient craftsmen. They became what they had always actually been, a permanent garrison standing in formation above a place built on suffering and enforced silence, keeping watch to make sure the suffering stayed buried. The scrolls also documented the emperor's obsession with immortality in detail that the secondary historical accounts had only partially captured. He sent fleets of ships carrying thousands of young men and women to search for a legendary island at the edge of the world where a potion that defeated death was said to be kept by immortals. Those ships never returned. The most unsettling interpretation of their disappearance is that they were not lost at sea. Some historians believe the emperor arranged for them to never come back, because returning without the potion would mean standing before the court and confirming publicly that the emperor was a mortal man who was going to age and weaken and die like every other person who had ever lived. The ships that vanished may have been silenced for precisely the same reason everything else in this story was silenced. Some sections of the scrolls resist full translation even now. Certain passages appear to describe a process for bringing the clay figures to life, animating the army through breath and intention. Whether that was intended as literal instruction or as symbolic language embedded in ritual context is still debated among scholars. What it confirms beyond any doubt is that the emperor's belief in the mechanics of the supernatural was genuine. He was not performing ceremony for the benefit of his subjects. He believed that the clay army would, at the right moment, stand up. And the scrolls describe something buried beneath the main chamber that no modern excavation has ever located. A room containing gold and jewels on a scale that the ancient texts strain to describe. The scans have detected a massive empty space, approximately 3 full stories in height, positioned directly beneath the central palace floor. It appears to be real. It appears to match the description. But the scrolls come with a warning attached to it. The treasure is bathed in the poison of the stars. That phrase is almost certainly a reference to Mercury. mercury. And mercury is where this story reaches its final and most dangerous chapter. The poison that guards everything at the very center of the entire complex sits a location that no one has ever opened. No archaeologist, no government official, no researcher operating at any level of authorization. No one. The main tomb of the first emperor of China has been sealed for over 2,000 years, and it remains sealed today. Not because people have not wanted to open it, because they are afraid of what happens if they do. Soil samples taken from the ground around the central mound do not show mercury levels that are mildly elevated. They show concentrations that are hundreds of times higher than anything that occurs in nature. Ancient written accounts describe the emperor's architects engineering rivers of liquid mercury to flow continuously through a scale model of his palace inside the burial chamber. A miniature empire in silver running forever beneath the earth. The palace above in permanent miniature below. For a very long time, those accounts were categorized as legend, exaggeration. The kind of story that grows larger with every generation of retelling. The soil readings confirm that the core of the story is not exaggeration. It is documentation. If the main chamber were open today, the pressurized atmosphere that has been building inside it for 2,000 years would vent outward in an instant. Mercury vapor at the concentrations indicated by the soil data is acutely toxic. Lethal exposure can occur within minutes at far lower concentrations than what the data here suggests. What would begin as the most significant archaeological excavation in modern history could become a mass casualty event before anyone had time to respond. That is not the only threat. In the 1980s, researchers opened a smaller subsidiary pit for the first time. They watched as the paint on the clay soldiers, colors preserved in perfect condition for over 2 millennia, began peeling away within seconds of exposure to open air. The pressure and humidity change triggered an irreversible chemical reaction. Colors that had survived 2,000 years were gone before anyone could stop it. If the emperor's primary chamber contains wooden structures, silk textiles, or painted surfaces, opening the tomb could erase the very history it contains. The discovery and the destruction would happen at the same time. Lin's scans of the central structure only deepened of the mystery. The data matched ancient records about what lies inside the sealed chamber, but one conclusion became unmistakably clear. The emperor designed this place to remain sealed forever. The mercury, mechanical traps, immense depth, and layers of burial were all engineered to stop future generations from entering. He knew someone would eventually try.